My name is Toya Shendel Cox, and I'm the Virginia G. Schrader Curator of Art at the Evansville Museum. And we have an exciting program for our viewers today. You're going to learn from my intern for the last year, Cheyenne Miller, who's a student of USI, and she's going to teach us about printmaking in the 19th century. Shay, thank you so much for taking the time to talk about your internship project.
Thank you. Okay, so my name is Cheyenne Miller, as Tori was saying, and this is my internship presentation. I have my biography and reflection page here. If you want to read more, you can pause, but for the SparkNotes version, my name is Cheyenne Miller. I've been studying art history, French, and studio art, specifically printmaking, for the past 3 years at USI. So for a brief history of printmaking, the concept of printmaking can be traced all the way back to prehistory when you're considering cave art. But for our purposes, it was more or less introduced to the Western world in the 1400s. So in 1450, there's the invention of the Gutenberg press and the newly widespread availability of paper. And printmaking as an art form didn't really occur until the Renaissance and the Northern Baroque periods. And prints can be copies of paintings. They can stand alone as their own artworks. They can be political pamphlets or caricatures, and they can be whole books. So printmaking really paved the way for the dissemination of information and ideas during this period and ever since then. And it's been really important to our development as a society. So the three main printmaking techniques I will be discussing today are relief, which is usually woodcut or linocut. That's what I'll be talking about today. You usually will carve into a matrix, and the surface that's standing up, you ink up and print that. With intaglio, you usually scratch the surface. It can be like plexiglass or copper, and the recesses are what's inked up and printed. And then planographic or lithography is the basis, water and oil don't mix. So you'll have a greasy substrate, apply that to a matrix, and then that is what will eventually be printed. So for our first northern forerunner, we have Durer. Durer and Rembrandt both have had a lasting impact on the printmaking medium for the past hundreds of years, and they're essential in studying and understanding printmaking because they're two main old masters. So Durer was a draftsman, metalworker, painter, and a printmaker, and he typically worked with religious subject matter, portraiture, and zoological studies. Sorry, my Zoom was in the way a little bit.
No worries.
And he also introduced classical motifs into Northern art at the time. He had many different theories on mathematics, perspective, and ideal proportions. And he had a unique ability to marry the Northern ideals and the Italian ideals. So in Italy, you have antiquity, balance, coherence, and monumentality. And the Northern style was really elaborately detailed and decorated, and he was able to kind of combine those two and create his own style. It's very interesting. And he's had a lasting influence on the world of printmaking. And this piece was created in 1510 as part of a series of 12 woodcuts detailing the life of the Virgin. And this is the Assumption and Coronation of the Virgin. So I also have Rembrandt. He also was a draftsman, painter, and printmaker. He did a lot of mythological and religious scenes, as well as portraiture and landscapes. And he was also very well known for his self-portraits because they were reminiscent of what he was going through at that stage in his life. And he often created prints as copies of paintings as well. This one has the same subject matter and title as another one of his paintings. So in that way, it was just used to increase viewership and patronage. And this scene was a dinner scene from the Bible. And yeah. Okay, historical context. Another brief summary, just to illustrate what France was going through at the time. A lot of political upheaval not great things going on, but
yeah.
yeah. So the 1799 marks like the end of the French Revolution, and that was the big one with Marie Antoinette and Louis the 16th getting beheaded, let them eat cake, all that stuff. So we have the French First Republic from 1792 to 1804. 1804 to 1815 is Napoleon Bonaparte. And he honestly transformed France militarily and had given them like this taste of glory and pride immediately following like the devastation of the French Revolution. It was terrible for like everybody. So he like shows them what France can be, but maybe a little too obsessed with the power and the glory.
Yeah.
So he is also exiled at 1815, which leads to the Bourbon Restoration from 1815 to 1830, in which Daumier and Gavarni, two artists I'll be talking about next, were active. The Bourbon Restoration is exactly what it sounds like. So it's the restoration of the Bourbon monarchs to the throne.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that is the July monarchy with King Louis Philippe. And he was popular for a time. He was like the citizens' king, the bourgeoisie monarch. He was supposed to be for people's rights and for improving the economy, wealth disparity, eliminating that. Not what happened. He also, he was like all the other monarchs, like the wealth still stayed up in like the 1%. So he also was eventually overthrown. And also during his reign, the income gap actually widened pretty expansively. So it was not great. Yeah. And then the Second Republic with Napoleon III, who was a relative of the first Napoleon. And he launched a lot of gentrification efforts, dubbed Haussmannization after the Baron Haussmann.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all I'll be talking about for that. So printmaking in early 19th century France was marked by a lot of lithography. And this technique was actually invented in 1796 by Alois Sinnefelder. Mm-hmm. And two examples of lithographers are Daumier and Gavarni, which we will see in the next two slides. So here I have a little cartoon by Daumier. The translation is, "Ahoy, sailors, ahoy, land without fear on our island. The men are not cannibals, and you will not find a savage woman." So Daumier was known for his socio-political caricatures that would be printed in Le Charivari, a journal in France. Mm-hmm. And I thought this was interesting. It was named after a European folk tradition of holding like parades to punish wrongdoers. So I thought that was ironic, given that they usually published political commentary and satire. And actually, the French government banned political caricature in 1835, which leads to Daumier getting imprisoned for 6 months due to this caricature on the right of Louis Philippe, who we just talked about. Mm-hmm. Not a man for the people after all. And in this, he's depicted as Gargantua eating the citizens of France and their wealth. Mm-hmm. And then we have Paul Gavarni. He also made caricatures. I think this one's pretty funny. So there's like an old man sitting down in a top hat here, and then you have two costume people, a little fairy and a goblin, mm-hmm. Kind of like dissecting him, I guess. I don't know. So the caption reads, "It's a diplomat. It's a grocer. No, it's the husband of a nice woman. No, Caboche, my friend, you have drunk so much that you cannot see. Monsieur is a young joker like all, disguised as one annoyed to death." So I think that was just kind of a critique on people who are just the Victorian era, like everyone is very elegant and fancy, but you know, live a little. So now we have the Etching revival, took place kind of in the mid-century, and Charles Meryon is kind of known as the unofficial founder of the revival. And the revival began in France and spread to England and America, some of the surrounding areas. And etching had kind of fallen out of favor by this point due to like the commercial ability of lithography, its mass reproducibility. And during this time, etching had gained more traction in favor of its authenticity because the artists were more involved in the actual printing process. They could choose the color of the ink. They could ink up the matrix themselves, print it themselves. They had more control over how it was printed, what the final image looked like, and everything like that. So Meryon used etching as a way to highlight socioeconomic issues in Paris. His low economic class juxtaposed with his mental illness had like a sizable impact on his subject matter and stylistic choices. I mean, you can see in this, there's a lot of like cracked plaster, and it looks a little depressing. This is also because like his birthplace was the Ile de la Cité, which is island in the city, so it's kind of like in the Seine. And this is where like the poor people were kind of forced to live. And the poor Parisians were also known as like les classes dangereuses, which is just the dangerous classes. And they were thought to have brought suffering upon themselves because they were deemed naturally immoral by the people who did actually have money. And as a result, their dwellings were classified as ugly, misshapen, and raggedy. So due to the stigma, the poor areas in Paris, mainly in Ile de la Cité, which were medieval areas, would become the victims of the Haussmannization initiative. And most of those areas would be torn down or repurposed as government buildings, and the poor people would be forced out. So it was just like gentrification in 19th century Paris at that point. And Meryon actually died pretty young. He wasn't active as an artist for very long, but I thought that it was interesting. He was institutionalized in an asylum, and during his stay, he refused to eat or drink because he believed that he was Jesus Christ. So due to malnourishment and melancholia and regular hallucinations, he passed away. And this is kind of like a common theme with people studying Meryon. They like to characterize him mostly by his mental illness, but he was a very accomplished artist, and I mean, obviously very talented. So I wanted to keep that in there, but he also very good artist, started the etching revival more or less. So here we have Meissonier, who was mostly inspired by 17th century genre painting, contemporary history painting, and still lifes from the Northern Baroque period, really. And he created images of modern warfare and military life because his goal was to become the 19th century equivalent of Adam Franz van der Meulen, who was a court painter to Louis XIV. During his lifetime, he did garner international recognition, which is also ironic because finding information about him now is kind of difficult, but he was pretty famous back then for his artwork. And he had a unique ability to combine many elements in his artwork, including empirical truth, aesthetic judgment, and narrative sense. And because of these characteristics, his work is a significant example of the 19th century historical genre painting style. Okay, here we have James Tissot, who was a French painter and printmaker. He had lived in France, England, and the Middle East. And early in his career, he was inspired to draw women's apparel. mostly because his parents were both involved in like the textile trade at the time. And he liked to record his daily encounters with international socialites, whether it was in France or England. His mother was also a devout Roman Catholic, so she instilled that in her son. And later in his life, he would return to doing more religious scenes. And due to the Franco-Prussian War, he and many other artists, mostly impressionists from what I saw, actually immigrated to London to avoid the violence. And this is also why his name is anglicized, because his name's actually Jacques, but moves to England, changes to James. Here we have a frontispiece for his Parable series. And in this series, he provides like a modern adaptation of the biblical account from the Gospel of Luke, set in London. So for the first scene, we have the son, who's the central figure sitting on the table, petitioning his father for his share of inheritance while the window offers a view of the Thames River. And his father gives the inheritance to him under the assumption that he will go to India and improve the family business, which is also an illustration of the concept of primogeniture during that time. Usually the older son would have his share of inheritance and the younger son would be allowed to kind of do whatever he wanted. The older son would usually have more responsibility and the younger sons would go to India and see what they could do there. So in the second scene, we see that the son has not been using his inheritance to further the family business like he was supposed to. And he's actually been frequenting these entertainment establishments with Japanese influence. And this is also an example of Japonism, which permeated the 19th century following Commodore Matthew Perry's opening of Japan's borders to international trade. So many Western European artists were enthralled by Japanese art and just objects that they had. So you see geishas, paper lanterns, and a lot of Japanese influence in this piece.
And this is taking place in London, correct?
Yes. In the third scene, the prodigal son has returned to London penniless. And rather than chastising the young man, the father welcomes him back with open arms. The father warmly states to the older son, who you can see in the right corner, he kind of looks on, he's not very impressed. The father says, "You are ever with me, and all that I have is yours. But thy younger brother was lost, and now he is found." So I thought that was really heartwarming. He welcomes him back with open arms, very Christian. In the final scene, the prodigal son is being celebrated because he was lost in the temptations that life had to offer, but eventually found his way back to not only his family, but also to God. Due to his repentance, the prodigal son is deemed a victor while the elder son is kind of sidelined. And instead of forgiving his younger brother and welcoming his return, the elder brother feels kind of victimized by the brother's ability to like go off and mess up, but come back and be forgiven because he's been responsible this whole time. So, he doesn't really get it, but that's okay. So Tissot's retelling of the parable is kind of a critique on colonial enterprise and venture capitalism. And it also blends traditional printmaking characteristics of depicting religious subject matter, but also including like immense detail that kind of occurs with the etching revival. And the series also acts as a social and economic commentary, as well as a modern adaptation of the biblical account.
Mm-hmm.
So here we have Kathleen Newton, who is known as like Tissot's Irish muse. And all of the work that he created between meeting Kathleen in 1877 and her death in 1882 evokes kind of a distinct feeling of like simple domesticity And as seen on the left there, she was included in the Parable series. She was often a model for his works, both paintings and prints. And this is kind of just a fraction of all of the pieces that she was involved in. So this one, we have a young woman, Kathleen Newton, inattentively laying in a hammock while reading a book, and her head's kind of propped up and she's like gazing into the book. And also with the two other objects, the open parasol and the little bench to her side, she kind of creates like a triangular composition, which adds to the balance and overall like visual interest of it. This one we have the garden bench, which is a copy of a painting that Tissot completed in 1882. And it depicts Kathleen Newton and her three children seated on a bench with the mother in the center, her little boy sitting up top looking at the viewer, and the two daughters just kind of laying about lazily. And this is a good example of what Tissot and Newton really like to do. They would just hang out in the garden all day and take in the beauty. So I thought that was a sweet piece.
And it's also really great too, because that last piece emphasizes that religious aspect of the prodigal son, because here's the firstborn son, and basically all those responsibilities and the social pressures are going to be put on him. And so I think it's interesting that the mother is looking at him so almost divinely, like this is, you know, he's my golden ticket almost, and he doesn't even return that gaze. Instead, he not only dodges her gaze but is looking at you instead, almost like a, you see what I'm in, you see my position.
Yeah, and also just like placing him above all the rest too. That's kind of like an older characteristic of art, like showing the importance. So here we have Au bord de la mer, which is at the seaside. And you can see a woman, also Kathleen Newton, looking kind of outside the window. You can see like ship masts, a lighthouse. And I thought it was interesting. I didn't notice it at first, but Tori pointed it out. She's kind of in an S curve, which is a very Renaissance kind of pose, but it permeates art for the rest of, you know, art history. She's wearing, you know, pretty modest dress. She's got like a hand on her hip, so like it contorts the body a little bit more in an interesting way. And she's like resting her feet on the chair below, looking wistfully out. Thought that one was pretty. And here we have Renoir, who is usually dubbed an impressionist. I don't know. I'll let him be whatever he wants to be, but he also created kind of prints as copies of paintings. So this is one example. And this is called Le Chapeau Épinglé, which is like the pinned hat. But I thought it was interesting. The subject matter is actually La fille de Berthe Morisot et sa cousine, which is like the daughter of Berthe Morisot, also the niece of Manet, and her cousin Jean. And I thought it was interesting too that I feel like his impressionist painting style influences his printmaking also, because he's creating like thinner, more gestural lines with less acute detail. And it was interesting also because Renoir didn't become interested in printmaking until like the last 2 decades of his life. But in that time, he created like 60 prints or something like that. And also didn't know this until I looked at Tori's presentation, but towards the end of his life, he had arthritis really bad. So he kind of had to like mold the French, like, was it tape or glue or what? The paintbrush to his hand?
Literally bind it to him with different adhesives so that he could actually do his work. Yeah.
I found that fascinating. Work. I mean, like, you got to be dedicated to the craft.
Yes.
Okay, and then finally we have my favorite slide, the Tale of Two Nudes. This one is Renoir's Bather, and you can see she's in a Venus Pudica pose. And the first time this pose was used is actually the first time that we know of that a naked woman was ever depicted in art, which is Praxiteles' Aphrodite of Knidos. The original does not survive, so this is just a Roman copy from 1st century BCE. But we have enough copies to assume that this is the pose that she was in, with one hand over her chest and the other hand over her womanhood. And it's interesting because from one side, you can see her whole body, but she's staring straight into you. And from the other side, she's looking away, but you also can't see the good bits. So I've always thought that that was fascinating. And this piece begins the Venus Pudica pose, the tradition. Again, permeates art. I mean, this is like 1910. So, I mean, millennia. And so he has her, which she's outside. It looks to be like grass, high grass, water behind her. She's having one hand over her breast, one hand over her womanhood, which actually brings more attention to those areas than if she had not been covering them that way. And yeah, sorry.
What's fun about this? Oh, no worries.
So I missed a part. The word pudica comes from the Latin pudendis, which can mean either external genitalia or shame, or both simultaneously. And many artists pay homage to Praxiteles by emulating this pose in their work. So again, this is an example of how antiquity also has been a lasting influence on the world of printmaking, in addition to the world of painting, because printmaking can often be overlooked. But I feel like printmaking in 19th century France is indicative of a lot of the changing trends, as well as the trends that had been permeating art since Durer and Rembrandt. And this is one example, printmaking no exception, classical antiquity in this piece. And yeah, that was my presentation.
What was fun about this piece is when it was first created, it was deemed so beautiful and it was so provocative, because this is the first depiction of basically a woman nude, and she was on top of a pediment of a temple in Greece. And what was insane was men would actually climb up the columns of the temple, go to that pediment, and would actually make advances at the statue. And it became so normal for this to occur that the officials did not agree with the actions being taken, especially with their sculpture, to their goddess, that they had to actually employ soldiers to post in front of the temple so that the essentially the relations could no longer proceed. So this is an extremely powerful piece of art history. And while the original doesn't survive, probably for some of those reasons, it was documented enough that it was able to be recreated in the Roman regime, which is what we have today. And yeah, because that story was so impactful, we're seeing it being copied multiple times all throughout art history, and Renoir was no exception to that copying. So it's just amazing. I do love the fact that this that Renoir's Venus Pudica pose woman is outside, because that was also paying tribute, I think, to the original location for the Venus Pudica, outside, exposed, and in the open. But excuse me. But what I like about this is the fact that when we look at the artwork at the beginning, the Durer and the Renoir, and we compare it to the 19th century printmakers, you do see that type of basically recreation of Durer and Renoir, or sorry, in Rembrandt's works in their pieces. And specifically, if you can go back to the last Prodigal Son depiction right here, that makes me think of Christ's Last Supper that you just showed, or sorry, the Christ dinner print that you showed for Rembrandt. I mean, a lot of stylistically, those beautiful lines, that cute detail. It's just amazing to see those two works being paralleled. So just right here, I could definitely see stylistically how he was influenced by this piece to make that. I think that is just amazing to see this collection of 19th century prints and how it really furthered art, printmaking as an art form, but still being educational in the fact that there's still text that accompanies this. And I just think it's absolutely beautiful. It's kind of what I'm getting at with this compare and contrast from the Renaissance period and Gothic period to 19th century printmaking, and how a lot of these techniques and a lot of these styles are being transmitted and even redefined to make even better works. So that's why I think this is so important to discuss and to analyze.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I mean, all of these pieces are also currently influencing printmaking and how it's evolving today. So it's always important to look back at where we started, where we're going, and, making some guesses as to where we'll be even in like 20 years. So
That's
yeah.
right. Well, Shay, I really appreciate your time and thank you for sharing your project with us.
Thank you.